standing outside my own front door when I heard my mother laugh. Not a soft laugh. Not the kind of laugh you hear at a dinner table when someone tells a bad joke. It was the kind of laugh that comes from relief. From a person who has been waiting a long time for something. And finally has it within reach. My key was in my hand. My heels were still muddy from the cemetery. My husband had been in the ground for exactly 4 hours, and I was standing on my own porch unable to move because I recognized that laugh and what it meant. I pressed my back against the brick wall beside the door and listened. My brother-in-law's voice carried through the thin gap where the weather stripping had peeled away from the frame. He was talking fast, the way he always did when he was excited about money. I could hear him say the words liquid it and power of attorney, and before she even processes what happened, my mother responded. She said my name like it was something she was tired of carrying. I stood there for another full minute. The mud on my heels dried in the cold air. I did not cry. I was 31 years old, and I had just buried my husband, and instead of walking into my own house to fall apart in private, I was standing outside a door I owned, listening to my family divide me up. I made a decision right there on that porch. I put my key back in my purse. I turned around and walked to my car. I drove to a gas station 3 blocks away, sat in the parking lot, and called my attorney. His name was Mr. Ashford. He had handled everything for my husband. The trust, the properties, the accounts, the contingency plans my husband had insisted on, because he had grown up watching his own father's estate disappear into family litigation. Mr. Ashford answered on the second ring. I told him what I had just heard. I kept my voice flat because if I let it go, I would fall apart, and I did not have time for that yet. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How quickly can you get to my office?" I was there in 20 minutes. Here is what my husband had left me. Not what anyone suspected. Not what my mother had whispered to my brother-in-law at the reception after the funeral while I was in the bathroom. Not what my sister had tried to calculate on the drive from the church. What my husband had actually left me was a private trust worth $4.7 million, the full deed to our house, and a co-ownership stake in a commercial property his family had held in Charleston for over 2 decades. He had set it up quietly. 2 years before he got sick, he had told me about it, walked me through every document, every clause. He had held my hand at that conference table and said, "I need you to know where everything is, in case I'm not here to explain it." At the time I had cried because I didn't want to think about it. Now I was grateful down to my bones that he had made me listen. What my family did not know, what no one outside of that law office knew, was that the trust was airtight. My husband had specifically written a no-contest clause. Anyone who challenged the terms, anyone who attempted to dispute the beneficiary designations or initiate legal action against the estate would be automatically disinherited from a secondary bequest he had quietly set up for family members. A small gesture that became, under the circumstances, a very elegant trap. Mr. Ashford and I stayed in that office for 3 hours. By the time I left, I had signed the documents that transferred full legal control of the trust into my name, locked the deed to the house under my sole ownership, and authorized a quiet legal hold on the Charleston property, pending what we both suspected was coming. I drove home at 9 o'clock at night. The house was empty. My family had let themselves in with a spare key. I found evidence of them everywhere. Coffee cups in the sink. My husband's office chair pulled away from his desk in a way he never left it. A drawer in the master bedroom that I always kept closed was open 2 inches. I stood in the doorway of his office for a long time. I did not touch anything. I just stood there looking at the space where he used to sit, and I let myself feel it. The grief and the fury together, 2 things that had no business occupying the same body but somehow did. Then I closed the door and went to bed. 3 days later, my brother-in-law called. He was using his professional voice, the one he used when he was trying to sound like he was doing you a favor. He said he wanted to stop by and go over some things. He said there were certain financial matters that needed to be addressed quickly, and as the senior male in the family now, he felt it was his responsibility to help me navigate them. He used the phrase, "protect your interests," twice. I told him to come over the next morning. I spent that evening changing the lock on the front door. He arrived at 10 with my sister in the passenger seat and a man I had never seen before sitting in the back. The stranger was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a suit that was slightly too big for him, the collar gap at the neck, the sleeves a half-inch too long. He introduced himself as a financial consultant who specialized in estate planning for grieving families. I let them in. I offered coffee. I sat across from them on the sofa with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged into something soft and overwhelmed. My brother-in-law opened by expressing condolences. It lasted about 45 seconds before he pivoted. He said my husband had come to him privately, about 18 months ago, and asked for his financial guidance on some investments that had not performed the way they were expected to. He said my husband had borrowed a sum of money from him. He paused here for effect, and that the estate was now responsible for repaying that sum. He slid a document across the coffee table. I did not pick it up right away. I looked at it from a distance, the way you look at something that smells wrong before you commit to getting close. Then I leaned forward and scanned it. The number written on the document was $80,000. The signature at the bottom looked nothing like my husband's. My husband had a left-handed slant to his writing, a very specific pressure pattern he'd had since childhood. The signature on this paper was right-handed, straight and light. It looked like someone had practiced it twice and given up. I pressed my fingers together in my lap to keep them still. I said, I wasn't aware of this. My brother-in-law said that my husband had kept it from me to spare me the stress. My sister leaned forward and touched my knee in a way that felt like being patted by someone wearing rubber gloves. She said she knew this was hard to hear. But the family had agreed that the best way to honor my husband's memory was to settle his debts quickly and cleanly. She said there was a very straightforward solution. If I were to sign a limited power of attorney authorizing my brother-in-law to manage the estate accounts temporarily, he could handle all of it so I wouldn't have to. She was wearing my earrings, the pearl ones I had left on the dresser the night before the funeral. I noticed it when she leaned in and the light hit them. I had been looking for those earrings that morning and assumed I had misplaced them. I did not say anything about the earrings. I said, that makes sense. Can I have a few days to review the documents? My brother-in-law said of course. He was very warm about it. He patted the consultant on the shoulder and said they would give me space to process and circle back at the end of the week. The consultant nodded and wrote something in his portfolio. They stood to leave, and my sister gave me a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, in order to look sincere. After I closed the door behind them, I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I took out my phone and called Mr. Ashford. I described the document. I told him about the signature. He said, forward me everything you remember about the formatting. I said, I'm going to do something else first. I called a forensic document examiner I had found through Mr. Ashford's referral network, a woman who had spent 15 years working fraud cases in civil court. I will call her Ms. Brandt. She agreed to a consultation the following afternoon. What Ms. Brandt told me, after looking at the photographs I had taken of the document while pretending to review it, was that the signature showed none of the characteristic markers of my husband's authentic handwriting. The pressure distribution was wrong. The angle was wrong. The way the pen lifted between certain letters was inconsistent with someone who had been signing their name the same way for 30 years. She also noted that the paper stock appeared newer than the date printed on the document, not something most people would catch. But she was not most people. I had everything I needed. I did not go to the police, not yet. I went back to Mr. Ashford and we spent an afternoon building something much more useful than a complaint. The weekend before my brother-in-law expected my answer, my mother called. She was using her gentle voice, the one that meant she was about to say something that would require her to not be held accountable for it later. She said she was worried about me. She said I seemed to be shutting people out when what I needed was family around me. She said it was natural to struggle with finances after a loss and that there was no shame in accepting help from the people who loved me. I said, I know, Mom, I'm trying. She said my brother-in-law was only trying to ensure I didn't make any rash decisions from a place of grief. She said he had always been good with money and that my husband, God rest him, had not always been as financially savvy as he presented himself to be. I let that sit in the air for a second. She continued. She said that the property in Charleston was a particular concern. She said there was apparently some question about the co-ownership structure, and that my brother-in-law had a colleague who specialized in commercial real estate and could help me untangle it. She said the word untangle like it was something she had practiced. I said, that's so thoughtful. I'll think about it. After I hung up, I called Mr. Ashford and told him to place a formal legal notice on the Charleston property. Any attempt to transfer, encumber, or negotiate any interest in that property without my explicit written authorization and attorney notification was to be flagged immediately and escalated. He filed it the same afternoon. The following Thursday, I invited my brother-in-law back to the house. I told him I had made my decision. He arrived alone this time, no consultant, no portfolio. He brought a pen. I had arranged the living room so that the light came in a particular way. I had a reason for that. My husband had been meticulous about security after we had an attempted break-in 3 years ago, and he had installed two small cameras embedded in the bookcase and the smoke detector above the fireplace. They were pointed at the sitting area. My husband had shown me how to activate them from my phone. I had activated them 45 minutes before my brother-in-law arrived. He sat down. He asked if I had reviewed the documents. I said I had some questions. He leaned back in that way he had, the posture of someone who believes the conversation has already been decided in their favor. I said, "The date on the promissory note is March of last year. But you and my husband weren't speaking in March of last year. You had a falling out at Christmas. My husband didn't speak to you for 7 months." His expression didn't change immediately. It took about 3 seconds, which is longer than most people realize. He said there was no falling out, just a distance that happens sometimes between busy men. I said, "My husband wrote about it. He kept a journal. He wrote about it on December 27 and again in February." He said, "I'm not sure what you think you read." I said, "I also spoke to the branch manager at his bank. There's no record of a withdrawal or transfer in the amount listed on this document at any point in the last 3 years." He set the pen down on the coffee table. I continued. I said, "I want to understand something. When you came here with that document, when you brought that consultant and sat in my living room 8 days after I buried my husband, what exactly was the plan? Did you think I wouldn't look? Did you think grief makes a person stupid?" He started to stand up. I said, "Please sit down. We're not finished." He sat. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't crying. People expect grief to look a certain way, and when it doesn't, it disarms them. I told him clearly and without raising my voice that I had retained legal counsel, that the promissory note had been examined by a forensic document specialist, that the Charleston property had been formally protected, and that the trust my husband had left me was now fully transferred into my name and under legal lock. I told him that the signature on his document was going to be submitted to an expert for formal authentication, and that depending on the outcome of that analysis, there might be additional conversations, not with me, but with people who wore different kinds of suits than his consultant. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "I've heard that before." He picked up his pen and left. He didn't take the document with him. I photographed every page of it and sent the originals to Mr. Ashford that afternoon. My sister called that evening. She was not using a gentle voice. She said I had humiliated her husband. She said I had always been jealous of what she had. Always tried to undermine her. Always resented that she had chosen well and I had settled. She said the earrings. She actually brought up the earrings, which confirmed that she had taken them deliberately. Were just earrings, and I was being dramatic. I said, "I want them back by Friday." She said a great many more things after that. I let her finish. Then I said, "I think we both know what happened in this house, and I think we both know where this is going. I hope you make good choices going forward." I hung up. The earrings were on my doorstep Saturday morning in a small paper bag. No note. My mother did not call for 2 weeks. When she finally did, her voice was different. Quieter, stripped of the performance. She said she didn't know things had gone as far as they had. She said she had only wanted what was best for the family. I said, "I know you believe that." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Are you all right?" It was the first time in the entire month since my husband died that anyone in my family had asked me that. Not whether the accounts were accessible, not whether the property title was clear, not whether I had thought about what I was going to do at the house, just, "Are you all right?" I said, "Not yet, but I'm going to be." And I meant it in a way I hadn't been able to mean anything since the morning the hospital called. The formal authentication came back 6 weeks later. The promissory note was confirmed as a fabricated document. The signature did not match any authenticated sample of my husband's handwriting in the examiner's database. Mr. Ashford submitted the report along with the camera footage to the appropriate authorities, and I stepped back and let the process move at its own pace. I did not attend any more family dinners that year. I did not respond to the group texts. I changed the code on the garage and had the remaining spare key returned to me. I planted something in the front yard that my husband had always wanted there. A small Japanese maple, barely a sapling, that would take years to reach the height he had imagined for it. I stood in the yard after I planted it and looked at the house. It was mine. It had always been mine. It just took losing everything else to understand what that meant. There are people in your life who love you in proportion to what you can offer them. And there are people who love you simply because you exist. Learning to tell them apart is not something anyone teaches you. You learn it in the hard moments, on porches, in parking lots, in the offices of good attorneys who answer on the second ring. My husband knew. He planned for it. He built me a shelter with his own hands and trusted me to find the door. I found it.